Hey guys, it's Mishel with Deception Bytes, and I'm back again, continuing on with the Q posts. Now, I did do one yesterday, and I had meant to do more yesterday, but what happened, I ended up having to do record the one video 3 times because of weird sound issues. So, I didn't get to do any more last night, and when I went on to research the next post that we're going to get into now, I literally kind of fell into a deep rabbit hole, and I found out stuff that I just have never heard before, and well, to say it blew me away would be an understatement. So let's get into that now. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. This is going to be a long post and probably a very difficult one to get through. So I think I'm going to break this into 2 because there's so much information here to go through that I'm just not sure how fast I'm going to get through it. And if I have to break it in 2, I will do them both tonight so that I can get this post, finished. But anyway, that's what I'm planning on doing. But we'll see. I might get through it faster than I think. So let's start. Sunday, 12th of November. Q asks, how did Soros replace Family Y? Who is Family Y? Family Y is the Rockefellers. Okay, now picture the 3 sides of a triangle, and remember that Q told us that presently the triangle of the New World Order, one side is represented by Soros, one side is represented by Rothschild, and one side is represented by the House of Saud. Now, one of those sides have been taken out. That's the House of Saud. So, you might ask yourself, well, what's he talking about then? What about, why is he saying that Soros replaced Family Y? Well, Family Y, Soros replaced the Rockefellers because the Rockefellers used to be one of those sides of the triangle. It used to be Rockefeller, Rothschild, House of Saud. But Soros replaced Rockefellers. So now, how that happened exactly, I'm not sure, but it did. Trace the bloodlines of these 3 families. Now, when he says 3 families, he's talking about the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and not House of Saud. That does not come into this. I think he's talking about Hitler because that's who he's talking about. He's talking about Soros, Rockefellers, and Rothschilds. Those are the 3 families that he's talking about. Sorry, I had a temporary mind, whatever. My mind went on pause, I guess. Okay, so trace the bloodlines of these 3 families, and those are the 3 families. And we're going to do that as we go, so I'm not going to get into that right now because we've got articles to get to that is going to touch on that. What happened during World War II? And I think he's meaning with these families, okay? But and we're going to get to that. But I said it led to an explosion of globally centralized institutions like the United Nations and the European Community, now Union, and many others in finance, business, and the military. Precisely what they wanted. It also put countries under an enormous burden of debt on loans provided to all sides by the Rothschilds and the Illuminati. Okay, now, was Hitler a puppet? Now, sorry. Well, at first I said sort of, and I'll tell you the story behind that because I assumed I knew. And that's because I've taken so many courses on World War II, you would not even believe it. I've taken so many university courses on it. I've read probably close to 60 books on the Holocaust and Hitler's rise to power and Nazi Germany and World War II. I've just always been fascinated because I couldn't understand how something like that could happen. So I assumed, and I put sort of, because I knew that Preston Bush had helped finance him and so forth. So we're going to get into that. But now, after putting aside what I thought I knew and saying, okay, maybe I don't know. And that's when I actually learned something. So that's a good lesson for me. It's a good lesson for us all. If we think we know, we probably don't. Hitler, now this is the part, one of the things that blew my mind. Hitler was an illegitimate Rothschild. Well, actually, his father was an illegitimate Rothschild. His father, that would be Hitler's grandmother, got pregnant by a Rothschild and gave birth to Hitler's father. So, and we're going to get into that more. And then Q asks, who was his handler? So obviously the answer that Q is looking for is yes, because otherwise he wouldn't ask, who was his handler? And I said Rothschilds, and because there's some people have proposed other, I'm not sure. I believe it's Rothschilds. I really do, but we're gonna look at all this now. Was Hitler a puppet? Now, ask yourself the money questions. How did Germany recover so rapidly after being shattered by the great inflation of the early 1920s? 2. Where did the money come from to build Hitler's Autobahns and other capital-intensive projects in the 1930s, including the covert rearmament of Germany? Answer. Much of the money came from Fritz Thyssen and other top German industrialists and the American banks with which they had close connections. Foremost among these U.S. banks was the Union Banking Corporation, of which Prescott Bush, granddaddy of George W. Bush, was a founder director. So whilst Hitler could hardly be described as anyone's puppet, he was clearly beholden to these generous benefactors, including those in the USA during his rise. Now, I would disagree with that. I would say that Hitler was a puppet, a total puppet. Hitler's rebuilding of Germany's armed forces went unchallenged by the UK, France, and USA, even though it flagrantly broke the Versailles Treaty because the wealthy and powerful of the West wanted Germany to be the military bulwark against the expansion of Bolshevism, which they viewed as the greatest threat to their own survival. That's why they turned a blind eye to the destruction of democracy in Germany, to rearmament, and to the persecution of Jews, and ultimately the Holocaust itself. The puppet got out of control, but in doing so, he created a war that ended up as a very good business for the U.S. corporations and banks, who maintained profitable interests in Nazi Germany from end to end. Now, we're going to go to the next link here. Meet the real Adolf Hitler. Hitler was a Rothschild. This is Hitler's father. Now, Hitler's father was a Rothschild, and his name, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Alois Hitler. Now, there are some people who seriously doubt that Johann Georg Hitler was the father of Alois. Thyssen and Kohler, for example, claim that Chancellor Dollfuss had ordered the Austrian police to conduct a thorough investigation into the Hitler family. As a result of this investigation, a secret document was prepared that proved that Maria Anna Schicklgruber was living in Vienna at the time she conceived. Now that would be his mother, who would be Hitler's grandmother. And her name was Maria Anna Schicklgruber, was living in Vienna at the time she conceived. At that time, she was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered her pregnancy, she was sent back to her home in Spital, where Alois was born. If it is true that one of the Rothschilds is the real father of Alois Hitler, it would make Adolf a quarter Jew. According to these sources, Adolf Hitler knew of the existence of this document and the incriminating evidence it contained. In order to obtain it, he precipitated events in Austria and initiated the assassination of Dollfuss. According to this story, he failed to obtain the document at the time, since Dollfuss had secreted it and had told this guy whose name starts with an S, of its whereabouts, so that in the event of his death, the independence of Austria would remain assured. Several stories of this general character are in circulation, and that's from a book written by Langer, The Mind of Adolf Hitler. The super-rich families like the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, and Roosevelts all intermarry, and outsiders are not welcome. They believe that the U.S. should be a hereditary monarchy with their family members as kings and queens. Because of all their recessive genes, madness doesn't run in those families. It gallops. So I think that's it for this. There's other things here, but we have so much to get to. But I will say this. We've heard that Hitler was a genius, that he was an evil genius. He was supposed to be an evil genius who was intent on conquering the world. Let's look at his report card to see if this was true. Moral conduct, 3, very satisfactory. Religious instruction, adequate. Geography, adequate. Shorthand, below standard. Chemistry, adequate. Physics, very unsatisfactory. Diligence, irregular. German, below standard. Can you believe Hitler got below standard in German? History, adequate. Mathematics, below standard. Freehand drawing, good. Gymnastics, excellent. So there you go. Now, I also know that, and you've probably heard this, that Hitler wanted to be an artist, but his paintings and so forth were fairly mediocre. He couldn't make a living at it, and he couldn't get into the school that he wanted to go to. So he really, I don't know. And there's something else that they mention here, because it's basically, just let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah, he also avoided, he was a draft dodger. When he, the first thing that Hitler did when he invaded Austria was to find and confiscate his draft records. That was probably the main reason why he invaded his homeland. Interesting note, realizing that he was a Rothschild, we can understand why Hitler the Dunce could come out of nowhere and become Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's sister Paula was mentally retarded, but she still had more brains than her brother. The other son of Hitler's father, Alois, left the family in 1896 and went to work in Paris as a waiter. Called the black sheep of the family, disinherited, i.e. received only the legal minimum of his inheritance, he married an Irish girl and had a son named William Patrick Hitler. Alois had no relations with Adolf, the political leader. So, there you go. The other thing, and I don't see it in here. Oh, here it is. This is what I was looking for. Mein Kampf was, wait, hang on. There you have it. Adolf left Vienna and went to Munich for one reason, to avoid the draft. The man who sent millions to their deaths in combat was a draft dodger. Hitler's roommate during his Vienna days was Gustl Kubizek. He said that Hitler never read a book, never went to the library, and his sketches were awful. How then came he to write a book entitled Mein Kampf, which became a bestseller? Mein Kampf was ghostwritten by a Jesuit priest named Father I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name. Hitler the Dunce was the tool of much more cunning men. Hitler had only one talent. He was a good public speaker, and he knew how to harangue the masses. As the son of a civil servant, Hitler could have obtained a good job in Vienna had he been inclined to work. So that's interesting, but it's just the start. We've got some interesting stuff here. Now, this is taken from, like down where this question, what was the real purpose of the war? I've heard that the real purpose of the war was to establish Israel, but I don't know. But according to Albert Pike, he said the Second World War must be fomented by taking advantages of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that the political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would be then restrained and held in check until the time when we need it for the final social cataclysm. Albert Pike. After this Second World War, communism was made strong enough to begin taking over weaker governments. In 1945, at the Potsdam Conference between Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, a large portion of Europe was simply handed over to Russia. And on the other side of the world, the aftermath of the war with Japan helped to sweep the tide of communism into China. Interesting. And I would say, too, that, what was the purpose? What was the purpose in having Hitler Chancellor of Germany? And I'd say that the ultimate purpose was to prepare the way for the New World Order, to prepare the way for war and ultimately the New World Order. So, now, what age was George Soros? Now, I would assume that he means what age was he during the war? And in 1944, George Soros would have been 13. Now, what is Soros' family history? Well, and I put in brackets here, Soros is Rothschild's puppet, because he is. So let's look at his family history. They were Jewish. In 1936, Soros' family changed their name from the German Jewish Schwartz to Soros as protective camouflage in increasingly anti-Semitic Hungary. Tivadar liked the new name because it is a palindrome. You know what a palindrome is? A palindrome is something that backwards or forwards, it reads the same. And Soros, you can read it one way or read it backwards, and it's the same name. So that's a palindrome. Tivadar liked the new name because it is a palindrome and because of its meaning. In Hungarian, Soros means, quote, next in line. His family purchased documents to say that they were Christians, thereby allowing them to survive the war. Later that year, at age 14, Soros posed as Christian godson of an official of the collaborationist Hungarian government Ministry of Agriculture, who himself had a Jewish wife in hiding. Now, now this is going to, this literally, honestly, at first I said there is no way. So I kept researching and saying there's no way. But I'm pretty convinced this is true now. Who is Angela Merkel? Well, she's Germany's first woman chancellor, and she's Hitler's daughter. Can you believe that? Because I sure as heck didn't. Let's go out here. And so much to look at. So much to look at. Oh, first, let me show you this picture. What do you think of that? Now you tell me that's not Angela Merkel there with Hitler. And I'll tell you, you're lying. I mean, it's obviously her. Especially when you see other pictures of her at a young age, that it's definitely her. So, Angela Merkel is the daughter of Hitler, and Hitler was a Rothschild. Well, Hitler's father was a Rothschild. Hitler definitely had Rothschild blood in him. So, Merkel obviously has not only Hitler's blood, but Rothschild's blood as well. Now this is, I know this is out there, but not only does she have Rothschild blood and Hitler's blood, but they her surrogate or whatever was, they used the egg of Eva Braun's sister. So, I mean, this is, I know, honestly, like I would, if I had not been researching this for the last many, many hours, I would not believe it either. So, now, this is Adolf Hitler's mother, and this is Angela Merkel. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of similarity, especially in the eyes, but I wouldn't go all crazy about that. There's definitely a resemblance. And, you know, here they're putting Hitler and her side by side. And in some pictures, there really is a resemblance. Now, I'm sure you're aware that they took Hitler's sperm and they froze it. I've been aware of that for a very long time. And there's always been that question that, you know, are there children that belong to Hitler because they had his sperm? So, you know, I think that there was a movie or a book called The Boys from Brazil that was based on that very premise. So, what happened to Hitler's frozen sperm? Well, if it had been me, I would have flushed it down the toilet, but hey, it wasn't me. The Stasi file, according to the Stasi GDR file, the daughter of Hitler is now holding the same office as her father, Chancellor of Germany. She is said to be one of the most powerful human beings on earth, since she is also the president of the European Union, the EU, and the head of the powerful Western economic bloc known as the G8. More concerning is that Hitler's dream of uniting Europe under Germany/Vatican control is now within his daughter's reach. And interesting, look at them making the same sign. Isn't that interesting? Of course, it doesn't prove anything. I'm just saying it's interesting. In 1954, a child was born, a baby girl, whom the Stasi file identifies as Angela Merkel, today's Chancellor of Germany. Her official birthday is July 17th, 1954. However, the Stasi file, which is currently in the Soviet KGB archives, records her birth as April 20th, 1954. If this secret police citizens file in the Ministerium for, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, GDR, is correct, then Hitler's daughter, Angela Merkel, was born on Adolf Hitler's birthday, April 20th. Angela Merkel's birth, as detailed in the Stasi file, was based on the research of the German doctor Karl Klausberg. Karl Klauberg. Klauberg was classified as one of the worst Nazi angel of death doctors and was convicted by the Soviet courts as a war criminal. According to the reports, Dr. Klauberg was released by the Soviets after serving only 7 years of his sentence in return for turning over to the KGB his hidden files on his Nazi artificial insemination experience and, more horrifically, the frozen sperm of the former Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler. Now, there's a bloodline that you just wouldn't want to continue, but hey, that's just me. Hitler's father, who took the name Hitler, was the illegitimate son of Solomon Rothschild's mistress, Anna Marie Schicklgruber. Upon receipt of the Nazi files on artificial insemination, along with Hitler's frozen sperm, the Soviet Politburo authorized the experiments to resurrect, if possible, a child bearing the genetic markers of Adolf Hitler. It was reasoned that the combining of the genes between Hitler's sperm and Eva Braun's closest family would produce for the Soviets a near match of what a child of Hitler and Eva Braun would have been should one have been born. Dr. Klauberg brought Gretel Braun to the GDR Communist East Germany. She was the youngest sister of Hitler's wife, Eva Braun. Gretel Braun was chosen as the surrogate mother of Hitler's offspring using artificial insemination from Hitler's frozen sperm. Gretel Braun was a member of the Social Democratic Party, it should be SDP, not SPD, whose ideology centered on the principles of Marxism and the interests of the working class and trade unions. Now, I do see a resemblance here. This is Eva Braun. This is her sister, Gretel. And I do see a resemblance there. I definitely do. When Dr. Klauberg returned to West Germany, he was promptly imprisoned. He was murdered 2 years later while still in custody. Soon after the birth of Hitler's baby girl, an agreement between the Soviets, the Americans, and the Vatican was arranged. Hitler's baby was placed under the control of the Catholic Church through its connections with the GDR, Lutheran Church, which took custody of the baby. She was given a false date of birth, July 17th, and the name Angela Dorothea Kastner, daughter of Horst Kastner, a Lutheran pastor, and his wife, Herlinde, an English and Latin teacher. There, in the countryside at Templin in East Germany, Merkel was raised about 50 miles north of Berlin, the capital of the Socialist German Democratic Republic. The central theme of the agreement of the Western Allied powers, the Vatican and the Soviet, was that Hitler's daughter would be elevated to international power, but her ascendancy to power would not come until the Vatican also brought to power a German pope. In the wake of the death of Pope John Paul II, the former German Nazi Joseph Ratzinger was nominated. He took the name of Pope Benedict the 16th on April 20th, 2005 as Vicar of Rome. Is it a coincidence that this date was the anniversary of Adolf Hitler's birthday? In 1977, Angela Dorothea Kastner became Angela Merkel with her marriage to physicist Ulrich Merkel, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1982. She was elected Chancellor of Germany shortly after Pope Ratzinger assumed the leadership of the Roman Church on Hitler's birthday. And this is the Pope wearing the Nazi swastika as a member of the Hitler Youth, and I think we're all aware that he was a member of the Hitler Youth. And whoops, sorry. First day with the new hands. Okay, and here, like, okay, that's a satanic symbol. It's not, longhorns or whatever. Anyway, Merkel didn't enter politics until the age of 35 after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1990. She has been reluctant to discuss her past and private life. Well, I wonder why. Her biography stops short of suggesting that her father worked for the Stasi, the notorious East German secret police, but it says his pro-regime attitude helped Angela's career, allowing her to study at an elite school and go on to university at a time when the children of clergy were routinely refused admission. Here is a picture of Merkel in 1986 on an outing to the Baltic island of Rügen by members of the DDR version of the Hitler Youth, the FDJ or DDR, sitting near him. I think he means sitting near her. Is little Jelly Merkel. Very few people doubt that the man who raised Merkel and is known to the world as her father was a Stasi spy and part-time organizer. The German chancellor herself was an active Gruppenführerin in the FDJ. The teenage Merkel, like virtually all of her contemporaries, joined the Freie Deutsche Jugend, FDJ, the Communist Youth Organization. And there she is. Angela Merkel in her communist uniform marching with her communist comrades. They say birds of a feather flock together, but here's Merkel with a group of skinheads dating from 1992 or 1993. One of the people in the photos performs a Nazi salute in the presence of a younger Merkel. At the time, no one thought anything of it, but the photos were given a new significance years later. If the Soviet record is true and the evidence is strong, it opens up some amazing possibilities. The undeniable fact is that Angela Merkel came from obscurity to triumviral power as German Chancellor, President of the European Union, and head of the powerful G8 economic cartel. In an interview with the newspaper Frankfurter whatever, I can't pronounce that. In July 2005, Chancellor Angela Merkel admitted to an unusual obsession with the works of composer Richard Wagner, who was a Satanist. Wagner wrote the infamous composition called Parsifal. Yeah, I remember that actually. I remember reading about that in terms of Hitler. Wagner wrote the infamous composition called Parsifal, which was a favorite of Adolf Hitler as well. Hitler stated that the music of Wagner occupied his mind. Like Adolf Hitler, Angela Merkel is deeply fascinated with Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. The Valkyries were minor female deities that would ride through every battle to gather the most valiant of the slain and carry them off to a place called Valhalla, where they would wait to join the army of Odin in the last battle at the end of the world. Except for the little mustache, Merkel has a striking resemblance to Adolf Hitler. I do see some resemblance there, I must admit. And especially as she ages, with the aged Hitler. She's also a dead ringer for her mother, Gretel Braun. And I would, I do see a resemblance there as well. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was the illegitimate son of Maria Ann Schicklgruber. It was generally supposed that the father of Alois Hitler, Schicklgruber, was Johann George Heidler. There are some people who seriously doubt that Johann George Heidler was the father of Alois. An Australian document was prepared that proved Maria Anna Schicklgruber was living in Vienna at the time she conceived. At that time, she was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered her pregnancy, she was sent back home, where Alois was born. Langer's information came from the high-level Gestapo officer Kohler, published in 1940 under the title Inside the Gestapo. He writes about the investigations into Hitler's background carried out by the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss in the family files of Hitler. Kohler actually viewed a copy of the Dollfuss documents, which were given to him by Heydrich, the overlord of the Nazi Secret Service. The file, he wrote, caused much havoc no file in the world ever caused before. And that's from Inside the Gestapo, page 143. He also revealed that the second bundle in the blue file contained the documents collected by Dollfuss. The small-statured but big-hearted Austrian Chancellor must have known by such a personal file he might be able to check Hitler. His task was not difficult. As ruler of Austria, he could easily find out about the personal data and family of Adolf Hitler, who had been born on Austrian soil. Through the original birth certificates, police registration cards, protocols, etc., all contained in the original file, the Austrian Chancellor succeeded in piecing together the disjointed parts of the puzzle, creating a more or less logical entry. A little servant girl, Hitler's grandmother, came to Vienna and became a domestic servant, mostly working for rather rich families. But she was unlucky. Having been seduced, she was about to bear a child. She went home to her village for her confinement. Where was the little maid serving? In Vienna. This was not a very difficult problem. Very early Vienna had instituted the system of compulsory police registration. Both servants and the employers were exposed to heavy fines if they neglected this duty. Chancellor Dollfuss managed to discover the registration card. the little innocent maid, had been servant at the Rothschild mansion, and Hitler's unknown grandfather must be probably looked for in this magnificent house. The Dollfuss file stopped at that statement. Was Hitler's determination to take over Austria anything to do with his desire to destroy records of his lineage? A correspondent who has extensively researched this subject writes, "It appears to me that Hitler knew about his connection long before his chancellorship. Like his father before him, when the going got rough, the Hitlers went to Vienna." Hitler's father left his home village at an early age to seek his fortune in Vienna. When Hitler was orphaned after his mother died in December of 1907, he left for Vienna not long after the funeral. He seemed to drop out of sight for 10 months. What happened during his 10-month stay in Vienna is a complete mystery on which history sheds no light. It makes sense now that it has become established that Hitler was a Rothschild, that he and his cousins were getting acquainted, and his potential for future family endeavors was being sized up. And interestingly enough, every country he invaded became indebted to the Rothschild Central Bank. How about that? The Rothschilds and the Illuminati produce many offspring out of wedlock in their secret breeding programs, and these children are brought up under other names with other parents, like Bill Clinton, who is almost certainly a Rockefeller, produced in the same way. These ordinary kids from ordinary backgrounds go on to be extraordinarily successful in their chosen field. Hitler, too, would have produced unofficial children to maintain his strand of the bloodline, and there will obviously be people of his bloodline alive today, like Angela Merkel. So, which Rothschild was the grandfather of Hitler? My thanks to a website correspondent for the additional updated information to this article. A man has researched this story in some detail. Alois Hitler's father was born in 1837, in the period where Salomon Mayer was the only Rothschild who lived at the Vienna mansion. Even his wife did not live there because their marriage was so bad that she stayed in Frankfurt. Their son, Anselm Salomon, spent most of his working life in Paris and Frankfurt, away from Vienna and his father. Father Salomon Mayer lived alone at the Vienna mansion where Hitler's grandmother worked, is the prime, most obvious candidate. And Hermann von Goldschmidt, the son of Salomon Mayer's senior clerk, wrote a book published in 1917, which said of Salomon, by the 1840s, he had developed somewhat reckless enthusiasm for young girls, and he had a lecherous passion for young girls, his adventures with whom had to be hushed up by the police. And Hitler's grandmother, a young girl working under the same roof, would not have been the subject of Salomon's desire, and this same girl became pregnant while working there. So, I mean, it goes to say. And here we have the bloodline. There's Salomon Mayer von Rothschild, and who gave birth, well, he didn't give birth, but his son was Alois Hitler, illegitimate, and Alois' son was Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler's daughter was Angela Merkel. And her grandson became the Chancellor of Germany, funded by the Rothschilds, and he started the Second World War, which was so vital to the Rothschild Illuminati agenda. Funny how that happens, isn't it? I was just looking at this picture here, sorry. And the Illuminati are obsessed with putting their bloodlines into power on all sides in a conflict, and the Rothschilds are one of their most key bloodlines. And it is all a coincidence. And it is all a coincidence. Well, I would say not, personally. Now, I just think this is very interesting. It's all very interesting. And I'm just going down through these pictures so you can look at them. And here's Angela doing her little Illuminati signs. There's Hitler, same thing. There's Merkel and Hitler side by side. And I don't know what this is. It looks like she's got a mustache on, but I don't know. And here she's doing her little salute. I'm sure it was a joke to her, but in light of what we now know. And here are a bunch of people doing the okay. So, oops, sorry. I don't know what I did there. I think that's it for that. So, and to tell you the truth, we're just getting started. What is Angela Merkel's family history? Well, now that we know her real family history, I don't know if we need to go to her, what she says her, I think we've already looked at this, haven't we? Yeah, we have, sorry. I apologize. Okay, follow the bloodline. So, you know, obviously Q is quite aware of all this because he says follow the bloodline. It's all about the bloodlines. Now, we're going to get into the Titanic. And this, let me see how much we have to go here because this is a lot too. I'm wondering whether I should split it now or continue on. Not really sure how long I've been talking, so, but I'm sure you don't want me to be just sitting here hemming and hawing, so I guess I better decide. Well, let's go on, and I'll go on for a little bit, and then I think I may split it because it's just going to get too cumbersome. What year did the Titanic sink? Well, it sank in 1912. Why is this relevant? Well, a year later, the Federal Reserve came into being. Now, you might say, well, how do you get that from that? Well, it's only because I have the benefit of studying the whole post. That's why. What exactly happened to the Titanic? Well, we all know that, or at least we think we do. I thought I did, because that's another thing that I've studied a lot, is the Titanic. It just fascinates me. It's reported that it hit an iceberg, but now I have serious doubts about that. What class of people were guaranteed a lifeboat? Well, the elite, the first class people, and they were the elite because the tickets were absolutely extraordinarily expensive. Why did select individuals not make it into the lifeboats? Now, that's unknown to me because I know who he's talking about, but I'm not sure why they didn't make it into the lifeboats. And, you know, what Q is saying basically is that if you were in first class and you were one of the very important elites, you would be pretty much guaranteed a lifeboat. So why didn't the three very wealthy people on board, why did they perish? I don't know. Why is this relevant? Well, I think it's relevant because Q is obviously suggesting foul play here. That's what I would say. Now, this is interesting. In 1898, a man named Morgan Robertson penned a book called Wreck of the Titan about a luxury liner deemed unsinkable that was going too fast in the North Atlantic in April and hit an iceberg, killing most everyone on board due to lack of lifeboats. 14 years later, this fictional book would play out in real life exactly down to the name with the wreck of the Titanic. But this time it would have major political implications. Some of the wealthiest men in the world were on that ship, and some were opposed to the Federal Reserve and general banks. Fact, J.P. Morgan built the Titanic. Fact, J.P. Morgan was booked on the voyage but canceled at the last second. Fact, friend of J.P. Morgan, Milton Hershey, also canceled at the last moment and survived to build the Hershey food empire. Fact, there were no red flares on board to signal to any boats for rescue, only white flares that signal a party and that everything is okay. Fact, it was the first ship of its kind with the ability to seal decks electromagnetically, which could also seal people below deck. Fact, the captain, Edward Smith, was one of the most decorated captains of his time and would have been totally out of character by avoiding precautions. Just 1 second. Fact, the author of the book was poisoned to death a couple years after the Titanic sank. Fact, the Federal Reserve was formed the very next year. Fact, the Astor family was one of the richest families in the world, and John Astor III opposed the Federal Reserve. John Jacob Astor the fourth, the richest man in the world at the time, a friend of Nikola Tesla and an outspoken opponent of the creation of the Federal Reserve. Astor gained his wealth in part as a real estate builder, investor, and inventor. Other prominent Federal Reserve detractors such as Benjamin Guggenheim and Isa Strauss also died on board. Did J.P. Morgan get the idea of how to kill off the opposition to the Federal Reserve from a book written 14 years prior? This was a book titled The Titan, published 14 years before the Titanic sank, and look at the similarities. Did they hatch a plan at Jekyll Island to build a ship to eliminate the competition? Similarities to the Titanic. Although the novel was written before the Olympic-class Titanic had ever been designed, there are some remarkable similarities between the fictional and real-life counterparts. Like the Titanic, the fictional ship sank in April in the North Atlantic, and there were not enough lifeboats for the passengers. There were also similarities between the size, 800 foot long for Titan versus 882 foot 9 inches long for the Titanic. Speed, 25 knots for Titan, 21 knots for Titanic, and life-saving equipment. Beyond the name, the similarities between the Titanic and the fictional Titan include: the Titanic was the world's largest luxury liner, 882 feet, displacing 63,000 long tons, and was once described as being practically unsinkable. The Titan was the largest craft afloat and the greatest of the works of men, 800 feet, displacing 75,000 tons, and was considered unsinkable. The Titanic carried only 16 lifeboats plus 4 Engelhart folding lifeboats, less than half the number required for her passenger capacity of 3,000. The Titan carried as few as the law allowed, 24 lifeboats, less than half needed for her 3,000 capacity. Struck an iceberg. Moving too fast at 22.5 knots, the Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side on the night of April 14th, 1912 in the North Atlantic, 400 miles away from Newfoundland. Also on the April night in the North Atlantic, 400 miles from Newfoundland, Terra Nova, the Titan hit an iceberg while traveling at 25 knots, also on the starboard side. The unsinkable Titanic sank, and more than half of her 2,200 passengers died. The indestructible Titan also sank. More than half of her 2,500 passengers went down bow first. The Titan actually capsizing before it sank. Interesting. Now, I think what I'm going to do is cut it right here because we've got a lot to go through with the Titanic and so forth. There's a lot of information here, and we still have quite a bit to go. And then we've got the Hindenburg as well, which is all connected. So this is it for this one, and please stay tuned for the next one. I'm going to do it tonight and get it uploaded later this evening. So thanks for listening. I really appreciate you all, and I'll see you in the next video.